Good evening to everyone and welcome to ALIS Channel Talk. Today we are with the Executive Director of ECG Association, one of the most important associations in Europe, Mr. Mike Sturgeon. Welcome, Mike. Thank you to be here. And I would like to start with you with the first question. When was ECG born and what are the main areas of the association action?
Well, we celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. So we were born in 1997 as the platform for the vehicle logistics industry in Europe. And we've grown steadily since then. Our main activities are not typical for a European trade association, where the focus normally is on lobbying and working with the Brussels bubble, as they call it. So we do some of that, but not a lot. Our activities are much more practical. We have a lot of working groups. Working group topics would include anything from digitalization to quality to health and safety, things like that. So they're very practical things. But if you ask any of our members why they become members of ECG and stay members of ECG, most of them will say the priority is the networking. So we do various different networking activities. They can be some of the working groups, regional meetings, our Maritime and Ports group that meet around Europe. And then we have two, for us, big events a year. In May, we have a Spring Congress and General Assembly, and then in October every year, we have the ECG Conference, which is the biggest event in Europe for the vehicle logistics industry, where we welcomed last year 350 people.
Wow.
So we do a variety of different things, so a bit of events, working groups, some lobbying, and other things as the demand comes. So we respond to the wishes of the board and the membership.
So thank you. I would like to go ahead inside your sector. The automotive sector has gone through a period of great crisis during the pandemic. What are the prospects for the automotive sector at European level today?
That's quite a complex question. You're right. We've been through three crises, we say. We had the COVID crisis, then the automotive sector had a materials crisis, mostly microchips. So volumes dropped. Now we have a capacity crisis. As an industry, we don't have enough assets to move the cars. And now we're seeing perhaps a fourth crisis, the economic crisis. So we've seen growth of what we call alternative fuel vehicles, electric, plug-in hybrid, and so forth. But in the first half of this year, we've seen a very significant change. Mostly that seems to be driven by the economic situation. So in Scandinavia, for example, they're reporting a reduction in order take of 50% in the first half of this year, which is a huge shift by any measure. So the industry is going from last year having had a backlog of orders to this year that backlog now disappearing, and we're expecting now to see stocks building up even further because they can't find customers for them. We're aware of a number of major OEMs that have been selling from what they call pipeline, and they're now selling from stock.
Okay.
So there's another crisis building in terms of where to put the cars. And we're seeing what we term new OEMs, mostly Chinese, shipping cars to Europe. But a lot of those cars, with the exception of one or two brands, those cars are not finding customers right now. So again, stocks are building. And we're expecting to see some fragmentation of the market with all these new competitors. I could go on and talk about the problems in persuading people to buy electric cars. Now the early adopters have bought them. Now they have to persuade people who either can't afford them or have nowhere to charge them to buy them. And now they're meeting resistance. And then overhanging the new vehicles, there's a huge issue with residual values of electric vehicles as well.
Before the next question, a brief consideration. Trade tension between China and the United States of America escalate. The Cold War of the technologies and chips between the two powers has certainly not started today, but recent events worry those who look carefully at the new geopolitical balances and the stability of the global economy. Beijing's countermove has arrived. Xi Jinping, president, has responded to the embargo on semiconductor supplies imposed by the United States, and its allies with the announcement of the new restriction on overseas shipment of gallium and germanium imports since August. From your point of view, what will be the impact of this war on the European automotive system?
I don't know enough about the supply chains of the manufacturers for some of these rare earth minerals that China's potentially going to restrict. So it's quite hard to see, for me to be able to comment on how that might affect production. I think what we do see, though, whatever happens out of this, there's going to be significant competition from mostly Chinese manufacturers. Any trade war is clearly going to probably work in their favour. And I see the automotive sector in Europe being at huge risk at the moment, because the established manufacturers really only, when you have the sort of market share that some of the big OEMs have in Europe, there's only one way to go when you get situations like this. So we, for sure, are going to see fragmentation of some of the established manufacturers, and it would be a big surprise if we didn't see the market share in Europe of those established OEMs reduce considerably over the next years as the new OEMs come to market. And of course, it's not just the Chinese, it's Vietnamese, it's new OEMs in other countries. You have Fisker, which is European, you have Rivian coming from the States, so they're coming from everywhere. It's not just about the Chinese.
Thank you. About the logistics, ecological and digital transition, what do you think of the European Commission's ambitions regarding the digital and ecological transition in a transport and logistics sector, and are the goals achievable in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing to say is that typically the politicians are behind digital development. They don't respond or react as fast as digital develops, and I suppose that will never change. They can't predict the future. They always have to react to what comes. In terms of whether their goals are realistic or not, in some respects, particularly with emissions, they're setting incredibly challenging goals. But history tells us that unless the politicians do that, then we won't reach targets nearly as quickly. So it does need that political pressure to move things forward. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's things like I don't know, eliminating paperwork and customs issues and border issues, and just digitizing everything. There's a huge amount that can be done, and it's happening relatively quickly. Whether we're going to be able to achieve all the goals they're setting remains to be seen. For me, the big one is not a digital issue. I think increasingly we're seeing that perhaps the goals they've set on emissions for the automotive sector are not going to be achievable when the economy is going backwards as fast as it is today. Whether these things are affordable for the consumer is going to be very challenging.
Thank you. ECG is a point of reference for the European sector lobby. What are the main dossiers you are monitoring right now, and what difficulties do you see for the next future in our sector, in the vehicle sector, logistics sector?
because we're focused on a very specialist sector, there are not that many things that are unique to our sector. So historically, we've had one key objective, which as an association, I think we've had for more than 20 years. And that's the road sector and the issue of car transporters, where today almost every member state in Europe allows or has different rules about how you can load a car transporter. So we're not restricted to the basic 18.75 meters because most countries have a loaded length. So while the truck can only be 18.75, we can have overhangs at the front, at the rear, or both, depending on the country. We have two problems with that. One, if you have an international movement driving across a number of countries, you have to load your truck for the lowest common denominator along the route. And increasingly, we have a bigger problem, which is when you cross a border in Europe, it's not the national rules either side of the border that apply, it is EU law. And EU law does not recognize car transporters today, and therefore any border crossing with an overhang beyond 18.75 meters is technically illegal. And we're starting to see, particularly in Italy, we're starting to see the authorities fining trucks on international journeys for doing that, which is a huge risk for our industry. So our absolute priority is to resolve that, and we're extremely pleased to see in the greening freight package that the Commission issued just last Tuesday. They have, after much work on our part, there is a section in there which specifically references the loaded length of car transporters in the proposal. So we're going to be lobbying now with the Member States and with the European Parliament over the next months to make sure that that proposal is fine-tuned and becomes enshrined in law and changes the current weights and dimensions directive. So for us, that's really the only goal that we have right now, because everything else is more generic. And while things may affect our industry, it also affects the wider haulage industry or rail or shipping. So but that's unique to us.
Thank you. The last question, but about very important issue. The issue of specialistic training is very important for ALIS and for ECG. The shortage of the truck drivers is evident across Europe, all over the world. And I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, how can this be solved? And is it just a cultural issue?
I think at heart it is a cultural issue because we see it across the world. You know, there's a driver shortage in India, in North America. It's everywhere. So it's a cultural issue in that society clearly is unable to persuade young people that driving a truck is a good career opportunity. So culturally, we need to change that because the world is short of literally millions of drivers. So we have to change that. But if I look at our industry, I see that at a local level, our members are very creative in terms of how they source drivers. And it differs not just country by country, but company by company. Some work with schools and colleges in their local area. Others do different things. And we have a particular issue in our industry because the vehicle logistics industry, firstly, we have smaller cabs in our trucks. Secondly, we require a high degree of roaming, so we expect our drivers to sleep in the cab of the trucks more than a lot of other industries do. And it's also a tough, physically demanding and sometimes dangerous job. So of all the driving jobs out there, the one that I would never choose to do is driving a car transporter, because there are other jobs, as I'm sure you know, where you can go to work wearing a tie, driving your truck, and somebody else loads and unloads your truck for you with a forklift, and you stay in the cab. Our industry is not like that. But if I give you some specific examples, I was in one of our regional meetings in the UK and Ireland recently, and as I always do, I asked the members in the room what the driver shortage situation was like. And to my amazement, not one of the companies in the room was short of drivers on that day. And there are several reasons for that. One was because of the economic situation, we're seeing a downturn in general haulage. So they've managed to draw drivers from the general haulage sector to a degree, but also some very good innovation. One of the biggest company in the room had taken on 100 young people who did not even have driving licenses or truck licenses, trained them. They still had 87 of them, of those 100, working for the company. And they are now learning, and they're out there driving trucks on their own. They've experienced higher damage. Sadly, they'd even have 2 trucks rolled over. So they're having to accept higher insurance premiums, higher levels of damage, but 87 of those 100 are still driving for them. And I hope in 1 year's time that most of those 87 are still there. So it proves that with some focus and some creativity, you can solve the problem. You can persuade people to drive trucks. I would add that, generally speaking, over the last 2-3 years, we have seen most companies increase wages significantly for drivers in our sector. And that has to be an element in making it attractive for people to work in the sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I'm very proud to have you for the first time in our studio. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you soon as possible.
I'm sure you will. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.